with the demographics. The very basic, start with the simple, work our way up. So, what is a furry? Furries we're defining as self-identified fans of anthropomorphism. People who like giving animal traits, or human traits to animals, so walking, talking animals. This is very, very broad. What that means to individual furries, we leave up to them. But the important thing for our research is that to be a furry, you have to call yourself a furry. No one can look at you and say, you're a furry, you just don't know it yet. Case in point. Now, furries don't exist in isolation. We believe that the furry fandom overlaps quite significantly with other fandoms, and we've seen some evidence for that by comparing our different fandoms. So we find that 21% of furries call themselves bronies. 44% of furries also consider themselves to be anime fans. 11% of furries are sport fans. I couldn't resist. And on the flip side, when we study anime fans, we found that it's about 5 to 11%, depending on the sample, of anime fans consider themselves to be furries. We found that about 7 to 15% of anime fans consider themselves to be bronies, and 15 to 19% of anime fans consider themselves to be sport fans. So a lot of these fandoms overlap to varying degrees. So we're not studying furries in pure isolation. That's one thing we've had to keep in mind when analyzing these data. So in terms of the age of the fandom, we find that the average furry tends to be under the age of 25. More than 75% of furries tend to be under the age of 25. It's actually even lower than that, but our ethics board doesn't allow us to study minors. So it's actually quite a bit underneath that. We do find that in terms of gray muzzles, furries who consider themselves to be older in the fandom, the average gray muzzle is about 42.8 years old, and they constitute about 10% of the fandom. So in comparing the age of furries to other groups, we find that furries kind of fall somewhere in between anime fans and our sport fans. So the sport fans tended to be quite a bit older, and anime fans tended to be a little bit younger than furries. And interestingly, we found that the average anime fan actually got into anime at a younger age than furries getting into furry. Right, so specifically joining the group. What this might suggest in this case is that because it's more mainstream, anime fans were able to find anime a lot sooner and find a community of people who share their interests far sooner than furries, who may have to stumble around on the internet for a few years before they actually discover, hey, there's a group of folks that have the same interest as I do.
So what you're saying is anime is the gateway.
Yes.
Anime is the gateway. We don't have any evidence on that yet.
That's all happened for me.
In terms of the biological sex composition, so whether or not people were born male or female, we find that the fandom is predominantly male, just like many of these other fandoms are. Although interestingly, convention-going anime fans were almost a 50-50 split. So when you look at the anime community, those who go to conventions tend to be a pretty even split. But the furry fandom is predominantly male. When you look at so when you break it down even more and look at transgender individuals, you find that there are more transgender folk in the furry fandom than in these other groups, and far more so than the general population. Almost by a factor of 10, you find more transgender folk in the furry fandom than the general population. In terms of gender bending, this is the idea that you may sort of have been born with male bits, but your gender identity is much more what society would call female. We find that there is gender bending going on in both directions, but unlike the other groups we found, where females were sort of the ones who did all the gender bending, we find that in the furry fandom, males do it just as much. So if you look at the anime fandom or sport fandom, you see a lot of females who are women who are trying to sort of, or not trying to, but who more identify with masculine identities, whereas in the furry fandom you see quite a few males who identify with a more feminine identity. So this is something we're just starting to look into right now. We're just cracking into this data and trying to understand what it means, but it's a phenomenon that's worth looking at going forward. In terms of the ethnic breakdown of the furry fandom, we find that it's predominantly white, whiter than perhaps the other groups that we looked at. We look at other groups as well. We find that, lo and behold, there is a significant Asian population in the anime fandom. Given that the anime fandom is... Do you have a question?
How much is for the multiracial? Because I'm multiracial.
Yeah, so multiracial is its own category, and it was kind of a messy category, so I don't have the data here, but we do find that there's more sort of mixed race people in other fandoms as well than in the furry fandom. Yes, and so yeah, even among blacks, among Hispanics, among Asians, we do find that there are more of these in other fandoms than in the furry fandom. In terms of political attitudes, we find that furries tend to slant towards the liberal side of the scale, more so than perhaps sport fans, although they're pretty comparable to online anime fans at least. When you split up the political orientation into both sort of economic sort of liberalism, conservatism versus social liberalism, conservatism, we find that furries tend to be more socially liberal, more economically conservative.
So libertarian.
Libertarian. You see more libertarians in the furry fandom than in other groups. In terms of religiousness, we find that the furry fandom kind of falls somewhere between the anime fandom and the sport fandom. So this is a bit of a confusing figure. What we find here is that furries are, about half of furries are atheist or agnostic, about 25% of furries are Christian, and the other 25% are grab bag of everything that happens when you leave an other category in the religion. Pardon? Yes, anytime. So we find that furries aren't particularly religious. We don't. Most furries say that they don't necessarily adhere to a structured religious background, but we do find that a lot of furries consider themselves to be spiritual. So maybe they don't necessarily go to church every weekend, but they may have spiritual beliefs. In terms of education, this is misleading, by the way. We find that furries don't significantly differ in their education from these other three fandoms. These fandoms tend to be nerd-based fandoms and tend to be showing that furries have at least a little bit, on average, post-secondary education. The reason you see such a spike in the fantasy sport fandom is because they're about 5 or 6 years older on average, so they've had more time to go to university. So this is perhaps not super surprising. Is that what your question was?
Yeah, this is a higher bar means more education.
Yeah, higher bar means more education, yeah. Pardon me? No, this is out of 10.
Oh, that was 10.
Yeah. And the numbers mean things like, you know, some education, most education. I took them off for clarity's sake. But. In terms of living accommodations, there's this preconceived notion that furries are people who live in their parents' basements. There's some truth to that. But this is largely a product of the fact that furries are a relatively young fandom. When you break it down by age and you look at the furries who are under the age of 24 and the furries who are over the age of 24, that drops considerably. So a lot of the idea that furries live with their parents is driven by the fact that furries are relatively young. In terms of relationship status, we find that compared to the other groups, furries tend to be relatively less likely to be single. Furries are more likely to not be single than perhaps the online anime fans. It's a little less optimistic. And now we find that, so both furries and fantasy sport fans are relatively low in being single. For the fantasy sport fans, this is driven by the fact that so many of them are married. Because again, they are probably into their 30s at this point, so many of them are already married. For furries, we find that a lot of them are dating, and we find that much of this dating happens to be open or polyamorous. So the furry fandom is about 4 to 5 times more likely than the general population to be in open or polyamorous relationships. When breaking down, and looking at the sexual orientation of furries, we find that furries are a little bit more likely to be homosexual and a little less likely to be heterosexual. 30 or 40% difference. And fantasy sport fans tend to be overwhelmingly heterosexual. In terms of bisexuality, anyway, it's not a popularity contest.
It's not?
I win!
Anyway, no. No. So, yes, so furries are more likely to be bisexual, they're more likely to be homosexual than the other groups that we looked at. They're actually a little bit more likely than the general population to also be asexual. And more likely to just be other. When we give an other category and let them fill it in, furries are much more likely to use that option than any other groups that we study. Interestingly, when you look at the sexual orientation breakdown, you find something really unusual for the furry fandom that we didn't find in other fandoms. So in the other fandoms, the anime fandom, the fantasy sport fandom, we found that females were much more likely to be homosexual than males. But the reverse happens in the furry fandom. The furry fandom is the only fandom that we know of so far where males are far more likely to be gay than females. So to summarize this demographics section, we find that furries as a group are young, white, educated, white, middle-class males, on average, distinctly liberal-minded compared to the other groups, distinctly non-heterosexual, and in many ways comparable to related fandoms. So in terms of other things we've looked at, like socioeconomic status, we find that they are pretty comparable to other nerd-related fandoms. Here's our boring demographics out of the way. Let's talk about the more interesting, nitty-gritty idiosyncrasies of the